Hi, I'm Danny. I'm the founder of Taddy API, and I thought I'd go over a quick intro on how you can get the most out of Taddy API. And to start, I thought I'd briefly go over why people use Taddy API, and then we can dive into the code and see how you can use it in practice. So quickly, Taddy API is an API that makes it easy for anyone to add podcast data into their app. And what that means is we have a directory of about 4 million podcasts. And we're constantly checking these RSS feeds, these podcast feeds, for new and updated episodes. And to give some context on why Taddy API was built, 7 years ago, I built a podcast app called Podyssey, and I wish something like Taddy API existed. What I mean is I wanted a service that dealt with checking and scraping RSS feeds so I could focus on building my podcast app. And so Taddy API, we do all that work of checking our RSS feeds, making sure our API is always up to date. And then we give you helpful queries to easily get the data of what are all the podcasts and what are the new episodes. And I'll go over those queries right now. To start, the most basic thing is, how do you get details on any podcast or episode? So if you go to the docs, so this is Taddy API Podcast API docs. We're going to go over most of these right here. And so this just looks at, okay, how do you get the details on any podcast or episode and stuff like that. To start, we're actually going to click on this Intro to Taddy API link. And the reason we're going to do that is at the top here, you will see how you can get your API key. So every request to Taddy API needs to have your API key attached. And so we have a screenshot here of, log into your dashboard, copy your user ID and API key, and then put it in this format. These are the headers, the specific headers that we require, your user ID and API key. You can copy this and paste in your values in here. So over here, you can see we write our endpoint is api.taddy.org. That's our endpoint, which you can query. But if you go to it on a browser, it's also a playground where you can play around with different queries and see how the API responds. And we're going to do that right now. So first of all, get your user ID and API key. And for this playground, there's a header section down here. I'm going to click on it. You can paste in your headers down here. So this is my values. And then I'm just going to minimize it. But once you have that, you can make queries on our API. So the first one query we're going to go over, so we're going to go to the podcast API, and we're going to click on get details on any podcast. The first one we're going to go over is get podcast series. So get podcast series. If I go over here, you may notice you can get details on any podcast based on its unique identifier, your UID, its iTunes ID, the RSS URL of the podcast, or the name. I'm going to use name just because it's easy without knowing any UID off the top of my head. So I'm going to do a famous podcast called This American Life. Whoops. And I'm going to get back the UID, the name, the description. Great. So we can query our API and get back a response based on passing in one of these values. So I'm going to quickly go over the docs just to give you some context, and then the specific docs for this query, and then we'll go over the details. Get podcast series, it can take as input a UID, iTunes ID, RSS URL, or name. And what you get back in response, this is a GraphQL API. And briefly, if you go to the Intro to Taddy API page again, the first part is how to get your API key. The second part is if you are maybe unfamiliar with GraphQL, this is a helpful guide on what's the difference between REST and GraphQL. And so you can look at here for a quick summary of what that is. But then as you scroll down, we also say if you want to add GraphQL into your app, here are some libraries you can use. And then lastly, we give some tips on this is what a UUID means. This is how we do pagination, which I'll go over. And lastly, we end with, these are some errors you can get from API. So you can pass in an invalid API key. You can be hitting our API limit. There can be bad user input. If you pass in a query that's too complex, maybe we'll give you a query to complex error. So if you want a brief overview of GraphQL and specifically our API, this is a great intro guide for that. But if we specifically just care about this query, we get back a podcast series type. It's a GraphQL type. So in a GraphQL type, you can get back any of these things, and we'll add some stuff to here based on what we want and what our app needs to show. I just did these 3 basic things to start, but there are other options, like we add a description, but maybe you want the image of the podcast. That sounds useful. And then more importantly, maybe you want, if you want, the latest episodes of the podcast. So you can do the image, you can do the episodes. So this returns an array of episodes. So you can go back to UID of every episode, the name of every episode, the description of every episode, and maybe even the audio link to every episode. So if I press run, you will see the latest episodes for this podcast. If you read this episodes section, you will see some values on pagination. So like some values you can paste in by default, it does page 1, but we could do page 2 if we like, and we can also adjust the number of items that each page returns. I'm gonna do total episodes count as well, so that we see how many total episodes this podcast has, because I'm pretty sure it has 11. So page 2, these are after the first page of 10 results. This is page 2, and these are all the details you have. Other than episodes, you could also get back to genre the podcast is on. iTunes, we add about 1,000 podcasts a day to our API, and so if a podcast is added to iTunes, we also add it to our directory and then check the RSS feed every day or multiple times a day to make sure it's up to date. I'll go over transcripts a bit later. And we also have something called popularity rank, which is we check iTunes ratings and reviews to see how popular a podcast is. And then we just return. This is in the top 200 podcasts. And we have different categories for like top 2,000 podcasts, top 5,000 podcasts. You can get more details by checking the popularity rank docs to get more details on that. And lastly, what I wanted to go over is this one, feed refresh details. So feed refresh details show you how often we check this podcast for updates. So if I run this, we see this is web sub, and you can click into feed refresh details to get the options available for feed refresh. So we have about 4 million podcasts in a directory. The way we check all of them and make sure that our podcast API is up to date as possible is we categorize podcasts as high priority. So these are the top podcasts that most people want to see if there's a new episode immediately. Medium, regular, low, and inactive. And so we try to categorize things and check, every 2 hours, every 6 hours, every day for a certain number of podcasts. And we try to do a best job of making sure every podcast is up to date as much as we can. There's also one thing called web sub. So web sub is when a podcast notifies us that a new episode is out, and it's great because we update our API immediately when a new episode is out. But I would just note less than 10% of podcasts, maybe 10 to 15% of podcasts support this. So not every podcast support this, but for the podcast to do, like this podcast, we know almost immediately when a new episode is live, and then we update our API. Great. So that's Get Podcast Series. We dealt with how to get episodes and make our custom queries, and we also did pagination. Awesome. So that's Podcast Series. We could do the exact same for Get Podcast Episode. This one can take a UID, a GUID, which is a unique identifier from the RSS feed, or a episode's name. But FYI, multiple episodes can have the same or similar names. So even though it's possible, we recommend using UUID as it's a distinct identifier that we use inside Taddy. So we could get back the name. Again, the audio URL sound useful. We can get back the image URL for the specific episode if that's something we care about. We can get back how long the episode was, the file length, the season number, the episode number. These details are from the RSS feed. So this is great, and maybe you are just having to display episode details. But let's say you needed some podcast details as well. Well, you can refer back to the parent by returning the podcast series property. So you can get back anything from the podcast series. So we'll get back details on the episode, but we'll also get back some podcast series details. I'm just going to run that. So great. So we're getting details on the episode, but then also, hey, great, we also are seeing some details on the podcast series. Awesome. There's also transcript stuff, but I will save transcripts for a bit later in this video. I think that goes over how to get a podcast, how to get an episode. I'll quickly go over get multiple, because to be honest, it's the same. It's just you get multiple podcast series, but instead of passing in one UUID, you pass in an array of UUIDs. I saved a couple over here for ease, so we're going to paste in that, and we're going to paste in this one. So you pass in an array of UUIDs, and you get back an array back with details. So you now get back an array of stuff. So if you want to make a query where you get multiple podcast series back, this is your way of doing that. And the same goes for get multiple podcast episodes. You can get back multiple episodes if you'd like with the get multiple podcast episodes query. Awesome. So we've gone over how to get basic details from an API. Another popular thing people use their API for is search. So if you want to search through all 4 million podcasts and all 200 million episodes, we have a search query for that. So let's go back to our API. And the second one is full text search. So search. And let's go over basic search for this. So search is, you can pass in a term. I'm going to do one of my favorite podcasts. So Tim Ferriss. We're going to search for Tim Ferriss. So we can go over the docs in a second, but for caching reasons, we always have to return a search ID. You can search for a podcast with this name and description. We'll run that. Great. So the Tim Ferriss Show, which is the Tim Ferriss's podcast, and a bit of description, and some other Tim Ferriss related stuff that have the word Tim Ferriss somewhere in the name or description. You could also search for episodes by filtering for, so let's say you wanted to search for, by default it's podcast, but you could also search for podcast episodes. In this query, we're going to search for both podcast series and podcast episodes. And what that means is, in this query, I'm going to add a podcast episodes object right here. And so this is going to search for episodes that match this query type Tim Ferriss. Great. So you may notice it did take a bit longer. And I would say when you search for podcast episodes, it is searching through almost 200 million episodes. And so it will take a bit longer than just searching for a podcast series. If all you care about is podcast series, I would just remove this so that it is faster. But when you are searching through podcast episodes, it is a bit longer, and you can see how long it took down here. Okay, awesome. So at the top, we'll get an array of all the podcasts that match that term. And then if you scroll more, you'll get back the podcast episodes that match that term. And hey, just like before, if you wanted to also get details on the podcast series that podcast was in, you can query that, and you will also get, oh, hey, this is from the Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard podcast that he had Tim Ferriss on as a guest. Cool. Let's look at the docs. So, okay, searching for podcasts. So yes, we went over, you can search for a term for the type podcast series, but you can also search for podcasts and or episodes. You could also just search just for episodes by removing podcast series. We didn't go over pagination, but it's the same as we did before. Is you can pass in the page number and the items you want per page. I won't go over that because it's the same. What I will go over is sorting, matching, and filtering. So maybe the first thing to do is sorting. So this is our basic query. I'll go back to just searching podcast episodes. And then I'll do sort by. And so sort by, you have two options. By default, it's exactness. And so that's what we've been doing. But we also have this option called popularity. And what this does is, so exactness matches this term and prioritizes exact matches more than if a podcast is popular or not. Podcast popularity limits the podcast to the top 5% of podcasts, but then it also prioritizes popularity over an exact match. Tim Ferriss, because he's a very popular person, I feel like we probably will get similar results back, but they may be in different order because we are ranking popularity a bit higher than exactness. It's just these podcasts are popular and Tim Ferriss is in the title and the description, which will rank really high for these episodes. Cool. So that's sorting. So if you care more about popularity than exactness, this is an option for you. The other one is match by. And so match by has three options. So exact phrase, all terms, and most terms. So exact phrase is, I need you to match just this exact phrase, however it is, in the description, name, and the other things we index in our search. But it's mainly, we prioritize name and description. So for that, actually, I'll use this example, Jim Farley. So Jim Farley is the CEO of Ford. You may be like, hey, I want to know what episodes he's been on. And a great way to do name searches on Taddy using this query is to use exact phrase, because you know this exact Tim Farley phrase is going to be in every podcast episode that gets returned. So let's search for that. And then you get back every episode that he's been in. And they are being prioritized. Whoa, he's also been on Dak Shepard. And you are getting it organized by popularity. But you are also making sure that Jim Farley is in all these podcasts. Great. Let's go with so there's exact match. There's all terms. So all terms means it has to have Jim and Farley, but it doesn't have to be in exactly that order, but both those terms have to show up. So if I run this, it will prioritize exact matches before. This is more lenient, and maybe what you want to use if it's not a name, if it's multiple terms that you want to match, like Ford and Tesla and Audi. It will make sure that all of these are in the name, description, and a couple of other items we index. So Ford, I see Ford, Tesla, and I'm sure Audi is here somewhere, BMW. Okay, Audi, there you go. Okay, so Ford, Tesla, Audi, this is all terms. And then lastly, most terms is the most lenient, and it just means any one of these. So if it's Ford, Tesla, or Audi, it doesn't have to have all, but it does prioritize exact matches, and it does prioritize having all. Great, so that is matching. And my last thing we already went over filtering for types. You can filter for an episode or a podcast series, but you can filter for other things. So you can filter just for business podcasts. Like, so you can go, oh, I just want business. But hey, FYI, there are different types of business. So maybe you want management, it could be in any of these careers. And so you can filter for a specific genre, not just, so now you get this term, but only in the business category. You can also filter for has transcripts to true. So does this episode come with a transcript? Well, if it does, we're only going to get those episodes back. And then we'll go over transcripts in a second. And so, great. And so the last thing I want to show is all the filter options you have. I went over only a couple of them, but you can search for the length of the podcast. You can search for when a podcast was released, how many episodes a podcast has, for if it has a transcript. So we do also provide chapters if it's provided by the podcast creator. And you can filter for those. And is safe mode, so you can return. By default, it returns everything, but you can set is safe mode to true if you only want to make sure that a podcast that is only marked with not having explicit content is returned. If, for example, you're doing this for a business use case and want to make sure it's brand friendly. useful from this intro to Taddy API docs that we glossed over is this section that says useful docs for AI. And what this is there are two docs that you can download, and I downloaded them. And one is a schema. So this is the GraphQL schema, which is every query, every property that our API uses, and it's in a schema file. And then the other document is this full documentation downloaded as one big markdown file. And so when you have those two, you can upload it to ChatGPT or another service you use, and you can ask it questions, and I asked it a question, I'm building a screen to show podcasts from the latest 10 episodes, write a query, and I passed in those documents, and help me write that query. And my other option is, okay, if you're reading the docs and are insuring something, use ChatGPT or something similar, and you can be helpful for answering some of your questions if you do have some. Awesome. I think I'm done with this one, search. And let's move on to transcripts. So transcripts, this one right here. So actually, maybe transcripts are the longest. So we do a couple of things with transcripts. And I should say, podcasts can provide their own transcript in the RSS feed. The problem is the most popular podcasts, and most podcasts do not do that. Like, for example, Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss do not provide a transcript. If a podcast creator does, any Taddy API user, free or paid, can access that transcript using the queries we're going to show. However, because not every podcast provides their own transcript, we actually automatically auto-generate podcasts for the most popular podcasts, and we offer it to our paid users. And so you have to be a paid user, but you can get any transcript from any episode in our API. And I'll go over how you can do that. And we separate into two things, I should say. We auto-generate transcripts for episodes from the most popular podcasts. We also generate transcripts on demand for any episode from our API. And so I'll go over that. So the next thing we will go over is how to get a transcript. So what I will quickly show is an easy way to get transcripts. So like this was a previous query. We can just put in the transcript property right here. So I'm going to run that. Downloading and parsing through a transcript will take longer than just querying our API. So FYI, if you want transcript details, just FYI, it may take a second or so. But here, you get the option of returning the transcript back for this episode. You also get different options. So you can say, instead of just giving me it in blank text, I would like some transcripts provide speaker identification. So they'll say not just the text, but they'll say who's talking. But then also you can get it broken down into utterances. So instead of the whole transcript, you can get timestamp for each phrase that someone is saying. And hey, look, for this specific podcast, they do provide speaker information. Cool. And so instead of utterances, we do also offer some options like style. So by default is utterances, but maybe you want paragraph. And so paragraph is not phrase level timestamps like this. It's more paragraph level timestamps. So they'll be a bit chunkier than phrases. So cool. So you get those two options. And then the third option is you get to also do, if you just want the URL to the transcript, and then you can download it yourself and do stuff with it yourself. You can also just get the URL to the transcript and do with it what you'd like. Awesome. We went over how to do basic transcripts. What you should also know, and what I should have gone over first, is how do you know if we're automatically generating podcasts for transcript? Well, for any podcast query, So this is the podcast for This American Life. We are checking the description, but we could also check Taddy, Taddy transcript status. So what this does is it tells you if we're automatically generating transcript for the podcast. So if I run that, it says we are transcribing. This will say transcribing or not transcribing. So we are transcribing, meaning every time a new episode is released, we then automatically transcribe it on our own GPU and upload it, and you are able to access it. So for This American Life, because it's a popular podcast, we are automatically transcribing episodes from it. You know that you can then ask for the transcript here and it won't be blank. And FYI, if you're a free user and you run this query, you won't be able to see this. This is transcripts are only available to our paid users. And so you can use the get podcast episode query, but I would actually suggest that we have a separate query called get episode transcript. So the idea behind this query, and so you pass in the UID for the episode you want a transcript for, which is this one. The reason behind this query is downloading the transcript and parsing it can be slow. Or it definitely is slower than just getting basic details on an episode. So if you want to separate getting basic details of the episode from getting the transcript of the episode, this query allows you to just get details on the transcript and nothing else. But you have the option, if you want to get details on the episode and the transcript, you have that option as well. So this will allow us to do the exact same thing we did before, which is start time code, end time code, and so we can run this and get transcript details, transcript details for this episode. Awesome. So we went over how to use get episode transcript, but also how you can get a transcript from get podcast episode. The other thing you should read in the docs is we do use credits. So like generating transcripts is not, we have to run it on our own GPU, so it does take some cost. And so we use credits for this. And I talk about the open source model we use to transcribe this and the number of credits you get for free. But FYI, by the time you watch this, I may have increased this number. But as of right now, users get 1,000 transcript credits a month. Other thing I want to talk about is this last thing called on-demand transcripts. So I just want to break it down to we provide transcripts through Taddy API, but FYI, we automatically transcribe episodes for the most popular podcasts. We do that automatically, and we try to do it as soon as it gets released. We try to transcribe it right away. But hey, there's 200 million episodes. We won't be able to transcribe every episode in our API. So if you want, we offer a real-time transcription, and it takes about 10 seconds for every 1 hour of audio being transcribed. You just have to pass in use on-demand credits if needed is true. So like if you go back here, and this will work for any episode, you can just pass in, yeah, I want the transcript, but use my on-demand credits. Yeah, great. You have the option of getting the transcript for any episode from our API. Feel free to read those docs. And then I just have a couple more things to show you. So went over transcripts. The other thing that I think people will find useful, this is a new query we just launched. I actually just launched it this week. Popular content. Great. So I'm going to, so this requires you to return popular rank ID for caching reasons. But this allows you to return the most popular podcasts in our API. And then you can, let's see, like you can do the popular rank for that. Awesome. So these are the most popular podcasts in our API. You can paginate this. You can get different pages. You can also filter this. So let's say you only want ones in the business category. So FYI, a podcast can be in only one of these business categories or in multiple business categories. So if you want a business one, I would make sure you're including all of these just to make sure any podcast in any one of these categories is returned. So filter for popular content, but in any one of these business categories. Also awesome. Let's run that. So awesome. These are the top business podcasts, and I see a Chinese one over here. And if I wanted to exclude that and just want the English ones, I can also filter by language. So if I want by genre, I can also just do the English ones. So if I run this, I can now get the top business English podcasts, and I can do what I want with that. Awesome. So this is a useful query if you care about popularity, and you get popularity from iTunes ratings and reviews. And in the future, I plan to also add Spotify reviews and rankings. Right now, we just use Apple Podcasts for our info. And then, cool. So that gives us popular content. Apple also provides a daily chart of the top podcasts or episodes by country or genre. And so if you want that information, so let's get the podcast series. Let's do by country, United States, and then let's do UID. Top. We need to do the top charts ID. Sorry, and then we just want the podcast series. We're gonna get the UID, the name, and the image. Let's say. So this will give us today's top podcasts in the United States. And then other than country, we also have a get top charts by genre. And so you can do, I want the top, and again, you can pass in the genre ones. These are all the business ones. So, hey, you get the top charts today by all these business podcasts. Great. So pass in all these genres, and get the top charts ID, get the podcast series, get the UID, get the name. Awesome. And let's run this. And so you can get back the podcast from Apple Podcast. Awesome. So this is the most popular podcast. And the last query I want to show you is get latest episodes. So get latest episodes so if you're building a podcast feed, and if you want to get the most recent episodes from multiple podcasts, right? So if you're building a podcast inbox, which shows you, oh, hey, if you subscribe to all these podcasts, these are the latest episodes from any of these podcasts. You can use this, and what it allows you is to pass in the UUID of a bunch of podcasts, up to 1,000. You can get the most recent episodes from any of these podcasts, and we're just going to run this. And so this is new episodes from these podcasts, and it's a helpful query to help you build a podcast feed if that is something you need in your application. Awesome. That's the last query I wanted to show you. And before I end, I just want to talk about one unique thing that Taddy API offers. That what we do is we give webhooks. So Taddy API checks and crawls RSS feeds and makes sure our API is up to date. When we do that, if you want a notification on your server that a new podcast has been released or a new episode has been released for a certain podcast, we send a notification to your server about that. Why that's useful is, let's say you want to push notify your users that a new episode is released for a podcast that they're subscribing to. We send you that webhook notification. You then know in your server who needs that application and the device IDs so that you can push notify them. For example, that's one use case. But you could also use this as a way to see if your brand has been mentioned in an episode, in certain episode descriptions. So you can use it for SEO or whatever business use case you need to have new episode or podcast details. So if you're a paid user, you can access this Webhooks feature, and then you can subscribe to new podcasts, updated podcasts, new episodes, updated episodes, new iTunes info if that's something you care about. Most people probably won't. And then lastly, this is the one. This is just, hey, if a new episode, if one or more episodes have been released for a podcast, send me a notification, and then maybe you want to push notify users or something like that. I think that's everything. Thank you for watching this video. Reach out to me if you have any questions or feedback. That's my email. And thanks again. Bye.